Welcome back, everybody. You join us for our open mic session. David, over to you.
Alicia, thanks so much. After listening to John's session about metadata and what a terrific suite of guiding principles, of conceptual ideas, and just how to make this work, it's such a pleasant opportunity to introduce Alexandra Neudek, who's going to make what John said practical. Alexandra is a fairly recent graduate of the graduate program at King's College. She exemplifies how delighted all of us who've worked in DAM for many, many years are to see formal education being offered and to attract professionals from varied backgrounds, which in Alexandra's case includes professional work in theater, in political relations and strategy, and in journalism, and to now have a degreed professional at the graduate level in our field. I was had a very delightful time working with Alexandra and learning from her presentation. And with no further ado, in honor of your theater background, Alexandra, welcome to your first presentation at a Henry Stewart event.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mr. Lipsey, and thanks so much to you all for tuning in. I'm here today to talk to you about implementing a consistent metadata strategy. So we're all here today because we all love metadata. As Mr. Lipsey said earlier, it's really the keys to the kingdom. But if we're here, we also probably know that creating a taxonomy and creating those fixed vocabulary terms is really only half the battle. We also have to have our users understand, use, and implement the system properly. How do we know when we've done that? This depends a little bit on who you ask as well as the sector, but very generally speaking, we know we're looking at a good set of metadata when all assets are described accurately, completely, and all terms are used consistently. And it's that last one I'll be talking about today. To help illustrate this process, I found a case study to help us do that. I'll start off by introducing the specifics of the case studies, as well as their anticipated obstacles in achieving consistency. From there, I'll discuss the things that they've done to mitigate these risks. That's going to be democratic initiatives, uniform knowledge, and self-governance. From there, I'll discuss some key takeaways and maybe have some time for some questions. So what's our case study? Our case study is a major multinational pharmaceutical company. They're currently updating the taxonomy system in their existing DAM that houses and records information about all of their products, past, future, and present. For instance, this DAM is going to say this type of inhaler is used for this acne, this type of inhaler is used for this type of asthma, and it's legal in this country, etc. They're doing this to comply with regulatory standards and promote cohesion among their entire office group. So this whole system will be implemented internationally. Who are our users? Our users are the entire product development team, and they're going to be the ones implementing the system. For the sake of today, I'm just going to be focusing on the compliance officers, since this is quite a lot of people. I also just want to make sure that my role here is clear, and that is really that of an observer. I was able to interview a close personal contact who is close to this case and come to my own analysis. So everything you're hearing from me in terms of analysis is all from me. Now, what are really the challenges in this case for implementing consistency with the metadata? The first, I think, is something we're all very familiar with, is that if you give two people who live on opposite ends of the world, sometimes opposite ends of the office, the same asset, they're liable to tag it in very different ways. And how this is true in medicine should be familiar to anyone who's walked into a drugstore at any other country. There is a huge variation in legality, dosage requirements, packaging, what have you, across all countries. On top of that, this system in particular is very complex. There are around 500,000 assets, 700 fixed vocabulary terms, and each asset needs to have around 50 terms ascribed to it. So this is really going to impede consistency because it's not something that we can expect our users to understand overnight or even in a few training sessions. The third is confusion, and I think that's really a combination of the both, where if you have a system that's already so predisposed to lack of agreement and you topple that with a very complex system, people are going to have a hard time buying into the system. They're going to get frustrated. They're going to impede other search results, and it's just going to snowball. And as I mentioned, this is a pharmaceutical company, so we absolutely don't want that. A high degree of conformity is very important to this case, since, as I'm sure we all know, pharma is done to the letter for reasons of legal defensibility, protecting the consumer, what have you. So how did they avoid this? The first set of initiatives that they did is what I like to call their democratic initiatives. They created, as a couple people have mentioned here today, they created a governance board. This governance board had every user and stakeholder group represented, and it was this group that created or really amended the taxonomy. From there, they also created preservation initiatives. Every month or so, they decided to meet, discuss issues on the ground, discuss issues with the taxonomy, as well as the appeal system. There's a system in place for users on the ground to submit appeals. If they don't like a term, if they don't think it's accurate, they're able to submit it and it'll make it to the governance board. These are really key in promoting consistency, since it really fosters buy-in and creates a more usable dam. It fosters buy-in because people feel like they're being heard, that they're being listened to, and are much more likely to pay attention to meetings and get that consistency you need. It also creates consistency because it's probably just going to be a better dam that's more intuitive for your users to use. So after they created this metadata taxonomy, they released it, but they didn't just release the taxonomy. They also released what I like to call uniform knowledge. As part of that, they created an extremely detailed guidebook, around 5 or so pages on each term. And they use that guidebook to cross-evaluate training sessions across the syndicate. This is very obvious in how it creates consistency, because it really creates conformity and promotes a single form of truth. It's very hard to argue on something when there's only one form of truth. And from there, they created what I call self-governance policies. In the system itself, there was a drop-down menu of what terms you could use, and there were restrictions on what terms people could say were part of the asset. Also, as part of people's performance review now, they were judged on how well they use the dam, whether they use the dam, etc. These are really important in promoting consistency because they reduce what I call major thought outliers and really narrow that margin of error. They also get rid of what I call renegades, and these are people who weren't going to buy into the system for their own reason or whatever. So we're not forcing them, but we're just giving them the gentle nudge in the right direction. How did it go? The jury is still out. Project is ongoing, but so far, so good. There's been a lot of enthusiasm about the new system. People are very engaged, and so far there have been no major trip-ups. And what we can learn from that, I think, is a lot. I'm writing my whole thesis topic on this. But the big thing today, I think, is that consistent metadata really begins with understanding user needs and promoting buy-in in a very multifaceted way. A lot of these initiatives I actually struggled with in how to present them because so many reinforce each other. For instance, this idea of institutional knowledge helps the governance board know what to talk about. The governance board mitigates the self-governance policies. All of these are really helping each other out in a multifaceted way. That's all I have time for today. I'm Alexandra N. Neudek. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to get in touch, please connect with me on LinkedIn or find me at alexandranneudek.com. I think we have time for a quick question.
I think we do. Alexandra, thanks so much for your presentation. What were some of the ways that this organization came to recognize the risks that were either in the shadows or had been experienced, and to pay this level of attentiveness to metadata and to metadata governance?
So I'm not quite sure because, as I mentioned, I'm not directly involved in the project, but my guess is that it has a lot to do with, as I mentioned, this idea of legal culpability, pharma very much being done to the law. Having this really high degree of consistency is going to be key, particularly for our legal compliance officers. So I don't know if there was a single body who decided it. A lot of these measures were pre-existing, but I think that it pretty much just comes all down to that.
And when you have renegade terms, it's an interesting question that came in. When you have renegade terms, how did you observe that those were managed?
So I don't quite understand how the people. These were
Well,
people
probably. I don't know if the question is about people or about semantics itself, but let's say it's about phrases itself. When there's a renegade word that's used and it's become common for a small set of people to refer to something by a particular term. Is it stuck onto a loose synonym tree, or do you have any observations about how that might have been handled? Understanding you were an outsider in this.
I think that would have been quite difficult because, as I mentioned, there was a lot of sort of control in what people could and could not say about particular assets. If there was a particular way, let's say someone was incorrectly tagging someone and some office got the idea that, oh, hey, we're going to tag it this way, I do think that would come up in the performance review, as I mentioned in my self-governance bit.
Mm-hmm. And with the governance board, Alexandra, was there a preset agenda that the board would issue out to people coming to the meeting? Or did you observe that people could make suggestions for what topics would be important to cover at the meeting?
I think, so this governance board and this taxonomy was pre-existing. I believe that when they were starting the process of updating this taxonomy, then it must have been an agendaed meeting, and to guide that, they really talked to people and got their opinions of, okay, what is this going to mean for this user group or that user group? You know, what do you think about this?
Great. Well, we've had a few other questions come in. We will forward those to you, including asking if your presentation will be one of those that might be available on the Henry Stewart site. And we'll send those questions along to you. And this is the point during the day, if we were together in New York, London, San Diego, Chicago this month or elsewhere, I would say, please join me in thanking you, Alexandria, for your presentation.